Hello and welcome to Nocab Game Design. In this episode, we take a look at the second combat operation of Chapter 18. That's right, this is the last level. So, do the developers stick the landing? Is it a good last level? And, more importantly for this video, what lessons can we as developers learn from this masterpiece game's last level to make our ending moments of our games memorable as well? In this last video of the Valkyria Chronicles Masterpiece series, I want to talk about three main things. First, I want to talk about the boss unit itself. How does it shake up compared to the other boss units we've seen so far? Second, I want to talk about the architecture, because in this series, I've talked a lot about the architecture, so I've got to touch on it here too, because it's got a couple unique elements that no other level seems to have had so far. And finally, I'm going to talk about the challenge here, specifically the difficulty, and the way the difficulty is increased in this level. Because, after all, this is a boss fight, and it's the last boss fight of the game. The players are expecting it to be the most challenging level they've encountered so far. So, how do the developers address this expectation? Well, I'll talk about it. But first, let's play. As the story goes, in the previous combat operation, Squad 7 has destroyed the Marmota and the super weapon, the Valkov. All that's left for them to take on now is Maximilian himself. This is a boss fight, and it's a classic one that is seen in a lot of games. The final boss unit is a single, massive entity, usually the enemy commander or the main antagonist of the entire work so far. Here, specifically, Maximilian is the vessel that is channeling a whole bunch of energy to artificially turn himself into a Valkyrie, an artificial superweapon. This is a common trope, where the bad guy literally turns into a monster of some kind, or is no longer human for the final showdown. Their internal evil has finally become external, and they become an abomination. There's a lot of games that feature this type of climactic final boss fight. The first BioShock game, Final Fantasy VI, even games like Batman Return to Arkham Asylum, all feature the main bad guy suddenly becoming a monstrous god of some kind, and the player has to deal with it. This is a common boss fight because it makes a lot of sense from a storytelling perspective. There's a lot of rich symbolism. Now, I won't get too far into the literary analysis and criticism weeds here because this is a game design channel. Suffice it to say that I understand why they put this type of boss encounter here. It fits really well with the story and makes a nice, clean ending. However, I'm always personally a little bit disappointed with these type of boss fight endings. From a game design perspective, they're usually pretty dull. Now yes, there are some add-ins to this mission profile that spices things up a little bit. The player has to destroy the towers to turn off the monster's shields, and then when the shields go down, the player can wallop on it. But the fact that this level can simply be reduced to a wallop fest kind of is antithetical to the entire Valkyria Chronicles games. This is a tactical, strategic game. The whole point of the gameplay for all of the previous levels was positioning your units and trying to outflank and get a better position, trying to capture bases and make forward progress, coming up with grand plans and complicated strategies of parallel team deployment, allocating your resources and then reallocating them as the situation evolves. But this level, this boss fight, doesn't scratch the same itch. Now yes, the level architecture here does make things a little bit more complicated, and the developers do throw us a couple of curveballs to increase the difficulty, and I'll talk about those next. But ultimately, the way that I beat this level was by running a bunch of units up in point-blank range and shooting him a couple of times. It didn't feel like a Valkyria Chronicles level. Now, this criticism is a game design criticism. I don't want to say that this was a bad level. This was an amazing level. It had emotional impact, and it presented an excellent climactic end to this story-driven game. I focus mostly on game design, but I also recognize that games are a piece of media. And what is the point of a piece of media but to tell stories? The developers of the Valkyria Chronicles clearly believed that their story that they had to tell was first and foremost the most important thing. And this boss fight encounter here really demonstrates and drives that point. That was not a design mistake. That was by design. The whole point of the game was to tell a story, and this was the climactic ending to that story. Any game design criticism that I make about this level kind of misses the point, and I recognize that and I want to point that out. However, I still am always disappointed when I see that the final boss of the entire game is just a beefcake that you have to wallop on a couple of times. In the intro, I said that the architecture of this level presented some unique attributes that no other level in this game has demonstrated. Well, that might be a bit of an over-exaggeration, but this level really does prominently feature some unusual architectural aspects. First of all, it's a really small level. There's not a lot of exploration or flanking opportunities, it's just this battle space. This really reminds me of some of the early game levels, some of the first couple of levels, where the developers were really trying to draw the player's focus on something. A smaller level architecture like this really forces the player to pay attention to whatever few things are inside of it. In the early levels, that was good to draw the player's attention, to teach them and train them via the tutorials. And here, in this boss fight encounter, the small level really draws the player's attention to, well, the boss fight. This level is also missing some key elements that almost every other level has. For starters, there's no sandbags. There's no natural defenses for a player to hide behind, and this makes a player uncomfortable, or at least it made me uncomfortable. Maximilian, the main target, the thing that's drawing the player's resources towards it, stands out in the open. This forces the player to also deploy their resources out in the open, and this is really uncomfortable. There's all these towers that are shooting at the player, not to mention Maximilian himself with his giant laser gun. So the player not only needs to carefully plan their approach, they also need to carefully plan their retreat. This is unusual. Most of the other levels are constant forward progress, but this level changes things up. Because the architecture is so open and so dangerous, it is forcing the player to now consider, how do I get out of here safely? Which is really cool. This is new. This is what a good boss fight should do. It should encourage a player to think outside of the box. It should be unique gameplay that's different than all of the other levels. And importantly, it's not unfair. It's not that there are no defenses. There are some, and I'll talk about those in a moment. It's just that there's no defenses that the player is used to. Defenses like sandbags or base camps just don't exist in this level. What this level does have are these well-insulated side paths the player can put their characters in to be safe over the enemy's turn. And yes, I guess there are some elevation changes or towers in the open central area so that you can stage resources in the battle space. But these are not the typical defensive resources that the developers have given to the player. The developers are simply reprioritizing the abilities that the player has always used in the gameplay so far. This is a really cool, good design. To summarize and generalize the main points here, the developers are withholding resources that the player is used to, and instead they're replacing them with something that's similar but different. And this forces the player to come up with different types of plans and ultimately change their gameplay. By removing the sandbags and replacing them with these side hallways that ring the entire level, the developers are changing up what it means to make progress. Instead of slowly, incrementally moving your units deeper into the level, progress now has to be made with hit and run tactics. The player now needs to come up with new types of plans in order to succeed. And this is all built on top of the new level architecture and this concept of replacing resources. Now, the last point that I want to make in this video is about challenge. And I know this is the third episode in a row where I talk about challenge. It'll be quick, I promise. In the previous section about architecture, I kind of touched on this idea that the developers are following the same formula, but they have changed some subtle things to spice up the level and force the player to try new techniques to change the player's gameplay. Well, the developers do the same thing here with challenge. Now, the formula, as you all should know by now, that challenge equals difficulty plus complexity. The new architecture adds a little bit of complexity, but how do the developers add difficulty here? The formula for difficulty is the same as it's always been. Take resources away from the player and/or give resources to the enemy. But the types of resources that are being taken away from the player in this level specifically is a type of resource that hasn't been taken in any previous level. The developers here are increasing the difficulty, but they're not doing it in any way that the player is used to. Specifically, the resource that's being taken away from the player is command points. Every single turn, these towers all turn back on and recharge Maximilian's shield, making him invulnerable again. So before the player can deal any damage, before the player can make any progress, they need to spend command points to destroy these towers. Now, this kind of mechanic is pretty common in games generally. Some kind of regenerative resource that the player constantly has to deal with. But the point I'm trying to make here is it's not common in this game particularly. In the past, once the player has destroyed something or captured a base, that was it. It never came back to life. But here in this boss fight, it does. And that's different. Now, it's not really earth-shatteringly different, but it's different enough where it forces the player to, well, play differently. The types of plans that the player needs to come up with in order to succeed here are different than the types of plans than they needed to use for the rest of the game. So this is the same formula for difficulty increase, take resources away from the player, but it's a new type of difficulty because it's a new type of resource. In this boss encounter, in an effort to make it unique, in an effort to make it stand out, not just story-wise, but in the gameplay itself, the developers have decided to drain a different type of resource altogether. This is really cool, and it forces players to think about the game differently than they have been for, well, the entire game so far. And this, in my opinion, has been good design. The broader lesson here, just because there's a formula underlying the game doesn't mean your gameplay has to be formulaic. It doesn't have to be predictable. This is where the experience of a good game designer comes in. By studying masterpiece games, not only do you learn the underlying rules for game design, but you also learn when to break those rules and what specific kinds of changes you can make to a game, and how those changes will impact gameplay. I firmly believe one of the best ways to learn game design is by playing games, both good and bad. But playing is only level 1. Level 2 is critically analyzing the games that you play. That's why I started this channel, because I want to get better at game design, and I want to take the lessons that I learn and share them with the rest of the world. So I encourage all of you to go out and play good games and talk about them. What makes them good? What makes them bad? What did you like and what didn't you like? Now, the second best way to learn game design is by watching other people play games and watching other people critically analyze those games. So if you've learned something, if you've enjoyed this discussion, or if you just want to get better at game design yourself, please consider subscribing. This is the last episode in the Valkyria Chronicles Masterpiece series, but it's not the last Masterpiece series that I have planned. So if you've enjoyed this video, this series, or just have your own ideas about game design, I strongly encourage you to subscribe and comment. And by doing so, yes, you support my channel, but you also teach the algorithm that you are interested in seeing more game design content. Both my own content, but content from other game design creators. And there's a lot of amazing game design resources out there. So with that shameless plug out of the way, I hope you enjoyed this video, and more importantly, I hope you enjoyed this entire series. If you're looking for more Valkyria Chronicles content, then let me recommend Precocious Turtle, Gaming for Perfectionists. They have a no commentary A rank walkthrough for every single level, and it's quite enjoyable and informative to watch through. It helped me out with some of the tough levels while I was working through this series. Link in the description. That's it for this video. In a poetic twist, this first Valkyria's Chronicle game ends in the same way that the first Halo game ends, with a massive explosion and the main character flying off into the sunset. Thanks for watching.
We've got to jump.
No problem.
That was a close one, bro.